Well, today, Earth Day. Well, not today is Earth. The 22nd is Earth Day. But this week, we really want to take a look at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and how it got started. And it actually started with this book, Rachel Carson, The Silent Spring. This might be the scariest book ever written. Let me just give you a couple of the chapter headlines. The Elixirs of Death. The Realms of the Soil, No Birds Sing, Rivers of Death, The Human Price. This is, if you go to the EPA website, they talk about this book. Completely discredited. Well, I'll let the facts stand for themselves. We begin with Earth Week and the EPA, global warming. All this week at this time. We begin there, episode 1, right now.
The most important day of the entire year is upon us. It's a day in which environmentalists will overlook and dismiss Earth's inhabitants and literally choose to celebrate the dirt beneath our feet. But Earth Day isn't really about picking up trash in your local park. It isn't about remembering to recycle your soda can. It isn't even about stopping to hug a tree. It has never been that innocent. Earth Day is a yearly reminder that humanity must be controlled, manipulated, and even destroyed for the good of the planet. How have we come to place a higher value on plant life than human life? Well, it all started with a Book of the Month Club. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, the book that is credited with igniting environmentalists in the United States. 150,000 copies of Silent Spring were mailed to the Book of the Month Club members and made their way into suburban America, with chapter titles such as Elixirs of Death and Rivers of Death. Carson successfully mixed eloquence and horror to instill fear about the popular insecticide
dichloro-diphenyltrichloroethane, for short DDT.
DDT is very good at killing bugs. This is how it works.
DDT is absorbed through the feet and spreads throughout the insect's entire nervous system. The effect is disastrous. DDT seems to literally drive bugs crazy.
But the idea that DDT could have disastrous effects on other wildlife and possibly humanity drove Rachel Carson crazy too. Even though Carson, a marine scientist and writer by trade, had no formal training on the subject of insecticides, she was convinced DDT inherently had great negative consequences.
Can anyone believe it is possible to lay down such a barrage of poisons on the surface of the earth without making it unfit for all life?
To answer Carson's question simply, yes. A lot of people did. In fact, DDT was considered to be a miracle powder that played an extraordinary role in winning World War II.
It may one day prove our greatest weapon towards victory over an enemy more murderous even than the fascist. Against disease.
During the Second World War, DDT was used to protect Allied troops and civilians from malaria, typhus, and other insect-borne diseases. Winston Churchill even praised DDT, remarking,
"We have discovered many preventives against tropical diseases and often against the onslaught of insects of all kinds, from lice to mosquitoes and back again. The excellent DDT powder, which has been fully experimented with and found to yield astonishing results, will henceforth be used on a great scale by the British forces in Burma and by the American and Australian forces in the Pacific and India in all theaters."
The insecticide proved to be invaluable against the Germans. In Italy, the fascists had strategically used mosquito-filled marshes to their advantage, and 22,000 Allied troops were inflicted with malaria, until the American forces deployed crop dusters and DDT spray teams on the area, wiping out the mosquitoes for good and allowing the Allies to liberate Rome. DDT's efficiency at destroying insect-borne illness was so great that many saw the potential in using DDT outside of theaters of war. As General James Simmons pointed out,
I consider this amazing chemical the most valuable contribution of our wartime medical research program to the future health and welfare, not only of this nation, but of the entire world.
Simmons was absolutely right. The entire world benefited from DDT. In 1948, the Nobel Prize was awarded to Dr. Paul Muller for discovering DDT. When Muller accepted the award, the presenter stated, "Thank you. Preventative medicine is now able to fight many diseases carried by insects on a way totally different from that employed heretofore." End quote. DDT truly was able to eradicate diseases like no other insecticide before it. In the immediate years preceding World War II, millions of Americans contracted malaria every year. But in 1952, after the U.S. Public Health Service's campaign to wipe out malaria by persuading people to use it in their homes, there were only 2 confirmed cases of the disease in the United States. Only 2. Seeing DDT's success in the U.S., Europe quickly followed suit and used the insecticide to completely eradicate malaria by the mid-1950s. South African cases dropped by 80%. India cut its malaria-caused death rate to almost 0. The National Academy of Sciences concluded in its report, in little more than 2 decades, DDT has prevented 500 million human deaths that would otherwise have been inevitable. The World Health Organization even stated that DDT had killed more insects and saved more people than any other substance. But no one seems to remember all the good that DDT has done for the people of the world. They only remember Rachel Carson saying things like this.
These sprays, dust, and aerosols are now applied almost universally to farms, gardens, forests, and homes. Non-selective chemicals that have the power to kill every insect, the good and the bad, to still the song of birds and the leaping of fish in the streams, all this, though the intended target may be only a few weeds or insects.
Carson's Silent Spring was so successful at spreading fear about DDT that even President John F. Kennedy was asked about it during a press conference August 29, 1962.
There appears to be growing concern among scientists as to the possibility of dangerous long-range side effects from the widespread use of DDT and other pesticides. Have you considered asking the Department of Agriculture or the Public Health Service to take a closer look at this?
Yes, and I know that they already are. I think particularly, of course, since Ms. Carson's book, but they are.
Rachel Carson's narrative that DDT was detrimental to both nature and human health was hungrily gobbled up by public and government officials alike. Within 8 years of its publication, Silent Spring was directly credited with the creation of the EPA. If you happen to find yourself on the EPA's website for whatever reason, the agency proudly draws its lineage back to Rachel Carson, stating, quote, Silent Spring played in the history of environmentalism roughly the same role that Uncle Tom's Cabin played in the abolitionist movement. In fact, the EPA today may be said without exaggeration to be the extended shadow of Rachel Carson. The influence of her book has brought together over 14,000 scientists, lawyers, managers, and other employees across the country to fight the good fight for environmental protection, end quote. Aside from igniting the environmental movement in America and helping to create the EPA, Rachel Carson ultimately succeeded in turning people against DDT, even though we have never had any reliable evidence of harmful effects on humans. In 1972, only 10 years after Silent Spring was published, the U.S. banned DDT, and other countries quickly followed our example. What happened next was a fulfillment of Rutgers University professor Robert White Stevens' ominous prediction.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts, completely unsupported by scientific experimental evidence and general practical experience in the field. If man were to faithfully follow the teachings of Miss Carson, we would return to the Dark Ages, and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth.
Once countries started falling prey to Carson's misinformation about DDT, malaria ran rampant. The devastating insect-borne disease once again ravaged South Africa and South American countries. Is this what Rachel Carson had in mind when she made the plea to remember the children?
We have to remember that children born today are exposed to these chemicals from birth, perhaps even before birth. Now, what is going to happen to them in adult life as a result of that exposure? We simply don't know.
What we do know is that without DDT, the consequences of living in a poor country plagued by malaria can be fatal. Robert Gwatz of the National Institutes of Health once remarked, "The ban on DDT may have killed 20 million children," end quote. One could argue that Rachel Carson cared more about the singing birds and the leaping fish than children. She was much more sinister than your average environmental crusader. One could also argue she was an accomplice to the millions of deaths around the world. Another environmentalist who rose to prominence in the 1960s was Paul Ehrlich. Ehrlich also wrote about DDT, stating, quote, "The introduction of DDT in 1946 brought rapid control over the mosquitoes which carry malaria. The death rate in Ceylon in 1945 was 22. It dropped 34% between 46 and 1947 and moved down to 10 in 1954. Since the sharp post-war drop, it has continued to decline and now stands at 8. Although part of the drop is doubtless due to the killing of other insects, which carry disease, and to other public health measures, but most of it can be accounted for by the control of malaria," end quote. It may sound like Paul Ehrlich is praising DDT, but he was actually in favor of banning the insecticide, but for a very different reason. It worked too well. Paul Ehrlich wished that DDT didn't just kill mosquitoes. He was far more interested in eradicating the true vermin of Earth, humanity. The story of Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb on the next chapter.
Population bomb is amazing. That's tomorrow. You don't want to miss it as we celebrate Earth Week.